Josephine froze when the black SUV jumped the curb behind her, tires screaming against wet Seoul asphalt. And a 7-year-old boy in a school uniform grabbed her hand so hard his nails cut into her skin. She didn't think. She grabbed a food cart, shoved it sideways into the SUV's path, and yanked the boy into an alley as gunfire chipped brick dust off the wall where his head had been 1 second earlier. If you want to know how a broke college girl from Brooklyn ended up on her knees in a Seoul alleyway with a Mafia Heir's blood pounding through her own veins like it was hers, stay with me to the end of this story, because what happens next changes everything for her, for the boy, and for the most feared crime lord in Korea. And if this story grips you the way it gripped me writing it, do me a favor and like this video and subscribe before you go, because trust me, you don't want to miss what this family becomes. 3 weeks earlier, Josephine Tell was just trying to survive Seoul on a graduate exchange stipend that barely covered instant noodles and subway fare. She had grown up in Bed-Stuy, raised by a grandmother who quoted scripture and Nina Simone in the same breath. And she had come to Korea to finish her thesis on comparative literature, not to fall into anybody's crime family. She picked up a tutoring gig through a sketchy expat forum, teaching English conversation to the son of some rich businessman twice a week for cash that actually made sense in one. She figured it was some stiff corporate father who wanted his kid fluent for international school. She had no idea the man who opened the gate of that mansion in Seongbuk-dong was Yoon Seok-hyun, head of the Yoon clan, a man whose name made grown gangsters cross the street. The first day she showed up, she almost turned around and left. The gate alone looked like something out of a Bond movie, iron and stone and cameras tucked into every hedge. A guard the size of a refrigerator patted down her tote bag, like she was smuggling explosives instead of flashcards, and a battered copy of Charlotte's Web. "I'm just here to teach English," she said, holding her hands up like she was under arrest. "I promise the only weapon in this bag is bad grammar." The guard didn't laugh. Korean humor, apparently, needed a subtitle. Inside, she met the boy first. Yoon Si-woo was small for 7, with round cheeks and serious eyes that looked far too old for his face, like he'd learned early that the world required caution. He studied her the way you'd study a new species at the zoo. "You're black," he said in Korean, then caught himself and repeated it in careful English, like he was testing whether the word was allowed. "You're black." "Last time I checked," Josephine said, crouching to his eye level. "You're short. We're both just facts today, huh?" Si-woo blinked, then, to her surprise, laughed. A real kid laugh that cracked something open in that cold marble house. From that moment, Josephine decided she liked this kid. What she didn't yet know was that a man in the shadows of the hallway, arms crossed, had watched the whole exchange and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt since his wife died 4 years earlier. Yoon Seok-hyun did not look like the men in the American movies Josephine had grown up watching. He wasn't loud. He didn't wear gold chains or shout orders. He wore a plain black suit, spoke in a low voice that made people lean in just to hear him, and moved through his own house like a man who trusted nothing and no one, not even the walls. When he finally stepped into the room to meet the new tutor, Josephine stood up too fast and nearly knocked over a lamp worth more than her tuition. "You're the tutor," he said, not really a question. "Josephine Tell," she said, sticking out her hand before remembering that maybe Korean businessmen didn't shake hands with random American grad students. He looked at her hand for a second too long, then shook it anyway, his grip firm and careful, like a man used to breaking things by accident. "My son likes you already," he said, glancing at Si-woo, who was pretending very hard not to be listening. "That is rare." "I have that effect on children and small dogs," Josephine said. "Grown men, results may vary." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth before he caught it and put it away, like a man closing a drawer he wasn't supposed to open. "Twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Payment is doubled if you're punctual." "Sir, I have never been late to anything with money attached," Josephine said. "I once ran 6 blocks in heels for a paycheck." He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her wonder if he could actually see through people, and then he left the room without another word. Josephine let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "He's always like that," Si-woo whispered, once his father's footsteps faded down the hall. "Scary at first, then less scary. Then he makes bad jokes that aren't funny, but everyone laughs anyway because he's scary." "Sounds like my old landlord," Josephine said, and Si-woo laughed again. For the first week, everything was strangely normal. If you could call teaching a Mafia Heir his ABCs in a house full of armed men normal. Josephine learned Woo's favorite snacks, his terrible handwriting, the way he hummed old trot songs his late mother used to sing. She learned the guards' names, learned to nod politely at the terrifying older man everyone called Uncle Taeyong, who ran security and who, despite his size, turned out to be a total softie for Woo, sneaking him candy when his father wasn't looking. She also started noticing the tension underneath the house's quiet, the way certain rooms went silent when a specific name came up. Yoon Dae-sung, the boss's cousin. Josephine only heard the name in passing, in hushed corners, in the careful way the staff's faces changed whenever he called the house. She met him on a Thursday, and every instinct she'd built up surviving New York at night screamed at her the second he walked in. Dae-sung was handsome in the practiced way of a man who had studied handsome in a mirror, all sharp suits and sharper smile, but his eyes didn't match his mouth. He looked at Woo the way a man looks at a stock he's waiting to short. "So you're the tutor everyone's talking about," Dae-sung said, looking Josephine up and down like she was an item on a menu. He found curious but wouldn't order. "An American and black too. Seok-hyun's really diversifying the household staff." "I prefer international consultant of small humans," Josephine said, keeping her voice light even as her stomach turned. "Title's on my business cards. I don't have business cards." Dae-sung's smile flickered, annoyed that she hadn't shrunk under his tone. "Cute," he said, then crouched in front of Woo, who instinctively stepped half behind Josephine's leg. "Hey, champ, you've gotten tall." "I saw you 2 weeks ago," Woo said flatly. "I haven't gotten tall in 2 weeks?" "Smart mouth," Dae-sung said, still smiling. And something in the way he said it made Josephine's skin crawl. He straightened up, gave her one more assessing look, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. "I don't like him," Woo said quietly once the front door had closed. "Why not, baby?" Josephine asked, crouching down. Woo shrugged in that way kids do when they know something is wrong, but don't have the words for it yet. "My dad says he's family, but family isn't supposed to make your stomach hurt." Josephine felt something cold settle in her chest, the same instinct that once told her not to get on a subway car with a man whose eyes were wrong. She filed it away, and she watched Dae-sung a little closer after that. The comedy of the house kept her sane through the growing unease. There was the day Josephine tried to explain Thanksgiving to Woo and ended up acting out a turkey so enthusiastically that Taeyang, watching from the doorway with his arms crossed, actually dropped his coffee laughing. "You people worship a bird," Taeyang said, wiping his eyes. "This explains a lot about America." "It's not worship, it's gratitude," Josephine said, still flapping her arms like wings. "With gravy." "Gravy makes it worship," Taeyang said solemnly and walked away like he'd made an unshakable philosophical point. There was also the disaster of Josephine trying kimchi jjigae for the first time in front of the household staff, sweating and fanning her mouth while insisting through tears that she was totally fine. This is a normal amount of spice for a human being. While Woo filmed her on his father's phone for what he called evidence. Even Seok-hyun, passing through the kitchen, paused just long enough to watch her wave a napkin like a distress flag, and Josephine could have sworn she caught him fighting a laugh before he disappeared around the corner like a man allergic to being caught enjoying himself. Slowly, without either of them naming it, something shifted between Josephine and Seok-hyun. He started finding reasons to be in the room during her lessons, standing by the window with his arms crossed, pretending to read reports while actually listening to his son laugh in a language that wasn't Woo's first. One evening, after a lesson ran long, Seok-hyun found Josephine in the kitchen making tea, and instead of leaving, he stayed. "You're good with him," Seok-hyun said, leaning against the counter, close enough that Josephine noticed he smelled. "Kids just need somebody to be honest with them," Josephine said, pouring 2 cups without thinking, then sliding one toward him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "And somebody who doesn't treat them like they're made of glass." Seok-hyun looked at the cup, then at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You're not afraid of this house," he said. "Everyone who works here is afraid of this house." "I grew up somewhere scarier than a nice house with a lot of guards," Josephine said honestly. "Different kind of scary, but scary's scary." He was quiet for a moment, turning the teacup slowly in his hands. "My wife used to say something like that. That fear is the same shape everywhere, just different sizes." "She sounds like she was smart." "She was," he said, and for the first time, Josephine saw something soften completely in his face, grief and warmth tangled together. Siwoo has her eyes. I noticed, Josephine said gently. He's got your stubbornness, though. Poor kid, dealt a rough hand. That earned her the first full, real laugh she'd heard from him, low and surprised, like it had been locked away somewhere and had forgotten how to get out. Their eyes met over the steam of 2 teacups, and for a second, the air between them went thick with something neither of them was ready to name. Then a guard knocked on the doorframe with an update about a shipment, and the moment folded itself back up, tucked away for later. But Josephine walked home that night with her heart doing something embarrassing in her chest, and she told herself firmly that falling for a mafia boss was, quote, not the move, Josephine. Focus on your thesis. Her thesis did not stand a chance. The attack came on a Tuesday, ordinary as any other day, which is exactly how these things always happen. Josephine had picked Siwoo up from his private tutoring session at a separate building because his usual driver had called in sick, and detail she'd later realize was not a coincidence at all. They were walking the 2 blocks back through a quiet side street, Siwoo chattering about a video game, when the black SUV mounted the curb behind them. That's the alley where we started. Josephine's body moved before her brain caught up, years of New York street instinct kicking in without permission, shoving a food cart into the SUV's path, yanking Siwoo into the alley as bullets chipped the brick beside them. She curled her body over his, heart slamming, waiting for pain that didn't come. When she looked up, 2 of Seok-hyun's men, who'd apparently been tailing them at a distance the boss never told her about, were already exchanging fire with the men in the SUV, and within a chaotic 30 seconds, the shooters peeled off and vanished into traffic. Josephine's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she checked Siwoo over, patting down his small arms and legs like she could shake the fear out of him by force. Are you hurt? Are you hurt, baby? Look at me, she kept saying, and Siwoo, to her shock, wasn't crying. He looked up at her with those old, serious eyes and said the last thing she expected. You didn't run, he said quietly. Everyone always thinks about running first. You didn't. Wasn't gonna leave you, Josephine said, voice cracking despite herself. Not happening. Not today, not any day. When Seok-hyun arrived at the safe house 20 minutes later, he didn't look like the composed man Josephine had grown used to. He looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in the car ride over. He dropped to his knees in front of his son, running his hands over him exactly the way Josephine had, checking, before pulling him into a crushing hug. Then he looked up at Josephine, and what was in his eyes wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something rawer. You put your body over my son, he said, voice low and shaking. You could have died. Wasn't thinking about that part, Josephine admitted, still trembling from adrenaline. Kind of regretting not thinking about that part, actually, now that we're discussing it calmly. He stood, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and before Josephine could brace herself, he pulled her into his arms too, tight enough that she felt his heart hammering against her ear. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Siwoo, watching from the couch, said the only thing that could have broken the tension. Are you guys gonna kiss now? Because I'm still here. Seok-hyun let go so fast Josephine nearly laughed despite everything. Go get changed, he told his son, voice rough with embarrassment he'd never admit to. Siwoo grinned like he'd won something and scampered off, and for a second, even with bullet holes still fresh in a brick wall 2 blocks away, the room felt almost warm. That night, once Siwoo was finally asleep in a guarded room down the hall, Seok-hyun found Josephine sitting on the safe house balcony, staring out at the Seoul skyline, still trying to get her hands to stop shaking. He sat down beside her without asking, close enough that their shoulders touched. I need to tell you what I do, he said quietly. You deserve to know exactly what you almost died for. I already figured it out, Seok-hyun, Josephine said, using his first name for the first time, and she watched him notice it. Mafia boss, feared name, scary house, scary guards, scary cousin who looks at your son like he's a line item. Seok-hyun turned sharply at that last part. What do you know about my cousin? Just that Siwoo doesn't trust him, Josephine said carefully, and kids are usually right about that stuff. Seok-hyun exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, looking for once like an exhausted father instead of a feared boss. Dae-sung is next in line if something happens to Siwoo, he admitted. My father structured the succession that way, generations ago. Blood ties, no exceptions. If Siwoo dies before he comes of age, Dae-sung inherits everything. Every business, every account, every soldier. Josephine felt ice settle in her stomach. So today wasn't random. No, Seok-hyun said, jaw tight. Today was a message. And I think I know exactly who sent it. You think your own cousin tried to have your son killed. I know it, Seok-hyun said. I just can't prove it yet. And in my world, you don't move against blood without proof, or the whole clan turns on you for breaking the rules instead of him for breaking the boy. Josephine sat with that for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker below them. Then we get proof, she said simply. Seok-hyun turned to look at her like she'd grown a second head. We? You think I'm walking away now? Josephine said, arching an eyebrow. After I dove behind a food cart for that kid? I'm invested now, Seok-hyun. Financially, I still get paid, right? But also emotionally. Mostly emotionally, if we're being honest, the pay is actually kind of low for the danger level. That surprised laugh came out of him again. Quieter this time, more tired, but real. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most reckless. In my experience, Josephine said, leaning her head back against the wall, those are usually the same woman. He looked at her for a long time then, something shifting fully open in his expression, unguarded in a way Josephine hadn't seen since she'd arrived in that house. My wife used to say, reckless people make the best allies, he said softly, because they've already decided the risk is worth it before anyone else has to convince them. Smart lady, Josephine said again, softer this time. She'd have liked you, Seok-hyun said, and it landed heavier than either of them expected, an unspoken door creaking open between them. They didn't kiss that night. It wasn't time yet, not with adrenaline and grief and danger all tangled together in the air. But when Seok-hyun finally stood to go check on his son one more time, his hand brushed hers, lingering just half a second too long to be accidental, and Josephine sat there afterward with her pulse doing things that had absolutely nothing to do with almost being shot. The next 2 weeks became a strange, tense rhythm of investigation disguised as ordinary life. Josephine kept tutoring Saiwoo during the day, kept up the act of being just the hired help, while quietly noticing everything. Which guards Dae-sung talked to privately, which shipments went missing paperwork, which staff members suddenly bought expensive things they shouldn't have been able to afford. Tae-yang, once he found out what really happened in that alley, appointed himself Josephine's unofficial bodyguard, following her around with the seriousness of a man guarding a national treasure. You're stuck to me like gum on a shoe, Josephine told him one afternoon, as he trailed her to the kitchen for the 4th time that day. Boss's orders, Tae-yang said, arms crossed. Also my orders. Also, I like watching you fail to make good coffee. It's the highlight of my week. This coffee is fine, Josephine said, glaring at the machine like it had personally wronged her. You put the grounds in the water tank, Tae-yang said flatly. That is not fine. That is a war crime. Even Siwoo got in on teasing her, having apparently decided that Josephine's clumsy attempts at Korean phrases were the funniest content available in the entire house. When she tried to tell the housekeeper, I'm sorry for the mess, and instead accidentally said something closer to, I am a mess made of sorries, the entire kitchen staff dissolved into laughter for a solid 5 minutes, while Josephine stood there with her dignity in ruins. In my defense, she told Seok-hyun later, arms crossed, Korean grammar is out here trying to end me specifically. You said something close to, I regret being born, Seok-hyun said, and this time he didn't even try to hide his smile. It was the best thing I've heard all week. Glad my suffering brings you joy. It does, he said simply, and the way he looked at her when he said it made her forget, just for a second, that they were investigating an attempted murder. The romance built slowly after that, stolen in margins between danger. At dinner, Seok-hyun insisted on cooking himself, badly, resulting in rice that could double as concrete, which Josephine ate anyway with a straight face until she couldn't hold it in anymore, and they both ended up laughing so hard, Siwoo came running to see what was wrong. A late night where Seok-hyun taught her to throw a proper punch, hands guiding her stance, close enough that neither of them was really thinking about self-defense anymore. A morning where she found him asleep at his desk, exhausted from running the investigation quietly alongside her, and she draped her own cardigan over his shoulders before she could stop herself. And he woke just enough to catch her wrist and murmur, half asleep, stay, before drifting off again, leaving her standing there with her heart absolutely wrecked. But the danger never fully receded. 10 days after the alley attack, Josephine found the first real piece of proof by accident, going through old delivery logs while waiting for Sai-woo to finish a bath, and noticed a shipment manifest with Dae-sung's private courier code on the exact same day and route as the assassin's SUV. She sat frozen at the desk, staring at it, before quietly photographing the page and slipping the original back exactly where she found it. That night, walking down the hallway to tell Seok-hyun what she'd found, she heard voices from his study, low and tense. She paused outside the door, and through the crack, she saw Dae-sung standing across from Seok-hyun, smiling that same too-practiced smile. "You've gotten soft since the tutor showed up," Dae-sung was saying. "The Yoon clan doesn't need a boss who's distracted by an American girl playing house with your son." "Careful," Seok-hyun said, voice low and dangerous in a way Josephine had never heard before. "You're talking about my family." "I am your family," Dae-sung said, spreading his hands. "She isn't. Remember that, cousin, before you let her get too comfortable in a life that was never meant for outsiders." Josephine's stomach twisted, half from the insult and half from the ice in Dae-sung's tone, a threat wrapped so carefully in politeness that most people wouldn't catch it. But she caught it, and she knew, standing there in that hallway, that whatever happened next, it was coming soon. She was right. 3 days later, everything broke open at once. It started with Si-woo's birthday, a rare event where the whole extended clan gathered at the main estate, a forced tradition Seok-hyun couldn't skip without raising suspicion. Josephine had been asked to attend as Si-woo's tutor, technically staff, though everyone in that room could feel the way Seok-hyun's eyes kept finding her across the courtyard, could feel the whispered questions starting among the older clan members about the American woman the boss couldn't stop watching. Dae-sung arrived late, smiling wide, carrying an expensive gift wrapped in gold paper, playing the doting cousin perfectly in front of the elders. Josephine watched him hand the gift to Si-woo with a knot of dread tightening in her chest, remembering the courier code, remembering the ice in his voice through that study door. "Open it, champ," Dae-sung said, crouching down with that same practiced warmth. "I picked it myself." Si-woo, ever cautious, glanced at Josephine before reaching for the box. Something told her to stop him. She didn't know what, not exactly, just the same cold instinct from that first meeting, and she moved without thinking, sliding her hand over the box before Si-woo could open it. "Let me see that first, sweetheart," she said lightly, keeping her voice easy even as her pulse spiked. "Grown-up rule. Tutors always check the presents first. It's basically the law." Dae-sung's smile didn't move, but something flickered behind his eyes, gone in an instant. "Odd rule," he said. "But sure, nothing to hide." She opened it carefully, in front of everyone, heart hammering, half expecting an explosion, and instead found an ordinary remote control car, perfectly innocent, sitting there mocking her paranoia in front of the entire assembled Yoon clan. Josephine felt her face heat as several elders exchanged amused, judgmental looks, and Dae-sung's laugh rang out easy and light. "Careful, cousin," Dae-sung said to Seok-hyun, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Your staff is a little jumpy." Josephine wanted the marble floor to swallow her whole, but later that night, cleaning up after the party, she found Tae-yang waiting for her in the kitchen, face grim, holding his phone out. "The remote control car," he said quietly. "I had it swept anyway after what you did, just in case." "And?" "Nothing in the toy," Tae-yang said. "But the wrapping paper. There's a tracking chip sewn into the ribbon. Small, cheap, easy to miss." Josephine's blood ran cold. "A tracker on a 7-year-old's birthday present." "Not to find him," Tae-yang said grimly. "To find you. Whoever's watching, they clocked how close the boss has gotten to you. This wasn't about killing Si-woo tonight. This was about learning your patterns, where you go, when you're alone." Josephine sat down hard on a kitchen stool, the reality of it settling over her like cold water. She wasn't just protecting Si-woo anymore. She'd become a target in her own right, simply for daring to matter to this family. She told Seok-hyun everything that night, laying the photographed courier manifest and the tracking chip on his desk side by side. He went very still, staring at the evidence, jaw working, before finally looking up at her with something fierce and furious burning behind his eyes. "This is enough," he said quietly. Enough to bring to the elders, enough to move against him. Seok-hyun, Josephine said carefully, if you move against your own cousin without airtight proof, you said it yourself. The clan turns on you. We need him to actually try something undeniable, in front of witnesses who can't be bought. You want to use my son as bait, Seok-hyun said, voice sharp with disbelief. No, Josephine said firmly. I want to use myself as bait. Daesung already thinks I'm just some tutor who got lucky in an alley. He underestimates me. That's an advantage. Let him come for me. Somewhere we control, somewhere Tae-yang can be watching every exit. Absolutely not, Seok-hyun said, standing so fast his chair scraped back. I am not putting you in danger to protect my family's business. You're not putting me anywhere, Josephine said, standing too, close enough now that she could feel the heat coming off him, the barely contained fear underneath his anger. I'm choosing this, because that little boy down the hall makes my chest hurt in a good way every single day, and because his father makes my chest hurt in a completely different, deeply inconvenient way. And I am not about to let some smiling snake take either of them from me. The room went very quiet. Seok-hyun looked at her like he was seeing something he'd been trying not to see for weeks, finally allowing himself to look straight at it. Say that part again, he said quietly. The second part. Which part? Josephine said, though she knew exactly which part, heat creeping up her neck. The part where I make your chest hurt, Seok-hyun said, taking a step closer, voice dropping low. Inconveniently, Josephine clarified, though her voice had lost most of its steadiness. Very inconveniently. I did not plan to fall for a mafia boss with a tragic backstory, and a kid who thinks turkeys are a religious experience. This was not on my 5-year plan. Mine either, Seok-hyun said, and then his hand was at her jaw, tilting her face up, and this time, finally, there was no interruption, no gunfire, no cousin, no 5-year plan standing in the way. He kissed her slow and certain, like a man who had spent 4 years convinced he'd never want anything again and had just been proven wrong. Josephine kissed him back with everything she'd been holding since that first cup of tea in the kitchen, and when they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Seok-hyun rested his forehead against hers. If anything happens to you, he murmured, I don't think I survive it a second time. Then make sure your men do their job, Josephine said softly, because I'm not backing out of this plan. He didn't like it, but 3 days later, they set it in motion anyway, because there was no other way to end this without ending it wrong. The bait was simple. Word was allowed to slip through a staff member everyone already suspected of leaking to Daesung, that Josephine would be walking Siwoo home alone from a private violin lesson without the usual security detail, because Seok-hyun would be attending an out-of-town meeting that couldn't be delayed. Every part of that story was fake except the route, which Tae-yang's men had quietly surrounded from 4 separate directions, cameras hidden in delivery vans, in flower shop awnings, in a fake construction crew working an entirely fake pothole. Josephine walked that street with Siwoo's hand in hers, chattering easily about nothing, her heart absolutely thundering under a calm face she'd perfected years ago, just trying to get home safe from the train at night. Siwoo led in on part of the plan because Seok-hyun refused to let his son be truly blindsided again, squeezed her hand once, a silent signal that he understood the game they were playing, brave in a way no 7-year-old should ever have to be.
The black sedan appeared exactly on schedule, sleek and unmarked, sliding up alongside them far too smoothly. The man who stepped out wasn't Daesung, of course. He was too careful for that, but Josephine recognized his voice instantly from a hallway she'd once eavesdropped outside of, one of Daesung's private couriers. The boy needs to come with us, the man said, polite in the way that made your skin crawl. Family emergency. His father sent us. Funny, Josephine said, keeping her voice light while her whole body coiled tight as a spring. His father specifically told me this morning that if anyone tried this exact line, I should scream really loud. So, she screamed. Loud, sharp, deliberate, the signal Tae-yang's men had been waiting for. Chaos erupted in seconds, hidden men pouring from the flower shop and the fake construction site, boxing the sedan in before its driver could even shift into reverse. The courier lunged for Siwoo anyway, panicked, and Josephine threw herself between them without a second's hesitation. taking the shove meant for the boy across her own shoulder, sending her stumbling hard into the pavement, pain blooming bright and immediate through her arm. But Siwoo was safe, shoved behind a parked car by Taeyong himself, who arrived in that same instant like a freight train, hauling the courier off his feet with one arm. By the time Seok-hyun's car screeched up moments later, having never actually left for that out-of-town meeting at all, the courier was zip-tied and furious on the sidewalk, and Josephine was sitting propped against a wall, cradling her arm, grimacing but very much alive. Seok-hyun was out of the car before it fully stopped, dropping to his knees in front of her exactly the way he had that first day in the alley, hands hovering like he was afraid to touch her and make it worse. "You screamed," he said, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I heard it through the radio. I have never run that fast in my life." "Worked, didn't it?" Josephine managed, wincing. Plan A, scream really loud. 10 out of 10 would recommend. "You could have broken your arm." "I could have," Josephine agreed. "But Siwoo didn't get thrown in a trunk, so I'm gonna go ahead and call this a win, personally." Siwoo threw himself into her lap then, sobbing the tears he'd been too brave to cry during the actual danger. And Josephine wrapped her good arm around him, wincing but not letting go, while Seok-hyun wrapped his arms around both of them at once. The three of them huddled together on a Seoul sidewalk, while Taeyong's men dragged the courier away for questioning. The courier talked fast once he understood exactly whose mercy he was at, especially once Taeyong made it very clear that cooperating with the boss was significantly more pleasant than the alternative. He confirmed everything: the courier code on the first attack, the tracking chip, direct orders from Daesung himself, promises of a cut of the inheritance once Siwoo was gone. It was the airtight proof Seok-hyun needed, undeniable, unbought, unbuyable, delivered straight into the hands of clan elders who no longer had any room to protect family loyalty over an attempted child murder. Daesung didn't even get the dignity of a dramatic showdown. He was summoned to an emergency clan meeting 2 days later, confident and smiling right up until the moment the elders laid the courier's signed confession on the table in front of him, alongside the tracking chip and the manifest. Josephine wasn't in that room, she wasn't clan. But she heard from Taeyong afterward that Daesung's composure cracked completely the second he realized there was no talking his way out of it this time, that generations of careful positioning had collapsed in one afternoon, because he'd underestimated a college girl from Brooklyn checking a present a little too carefully. He was stripped of his position, his assets frozen, and exiled from the clan's protection entirely, which in that world was its own kind of sentence. A man suddenly alone in a landscape built entirely on family loyalty he no longer had access to. Josephine's arm healed in a sling over the following weeks, and life in that cold marble house slowly stopped feeling so cold. Siwoo started sleeping through full nights again without nightmares. Taeyong started openly teasing her about her coffee skills without pretending it was reluctant. And Seok-hyun started showing up to her tutoring sessions not to loom in doorways anymore, but to sit right there on the floor with his son, learning English vocabulary badly on purpose just to make Siwoo laugh at his mistakes. One evening, weeks after the danger had finally settled, Seok-hyun found Josephine on that same balcony where they'd first really talked, watching the same skyline, her arm finally free of its sling. He sat down beside her, quiet for a long moment, before pulling something small out of his jacket pocket. "I had this made a week ago," he said, turning a small velvet box over in his hands like he wasn't sure how to start. "I've rewritten what I wanted to say to you about 11 times, which, according to my son, means I am, quote, being weird about it." "Your son has strong opinions," Josephine said, heart already pounding. "He does," Seok-hyun agreed. "He also told me very specifically that if I didn't ask you to stay forever, he was going to ask you himself, which I found both embarrassing and correct." He opened the box. Josephine's breath caught. "I did not expect to feel anything again after my wife died," Seok-hyun said quietly, voice rough with an honesty she'd rarely heard from him. "I built walls around this house and around myself, and then a stubborn woman from Brooklyn walked through my gate with flashcards and terrible Korean pronunciation and made my son laugh again, and made me laugh again, and dove behind a food cart for a boy who wasn't even hers to protect. Josephine Tell, I am asking you to marry me, not just to be my wife, to be Siwoo's mother properly the way he already thinks of you in his heart. Stay, not because it's convenient. because none of this makes sense without you in it anymore. Josephine's eyes were wet before he even finished. You had me at the food cart line, she said, laughing through tears. But yes. Yes, obviously yes, though I want it on record that I'm terrified of what your family Christmas parties are gonna be like now. He laughed, real and full, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't quite steady, and then kissed her slow and warm under that Seoul sky, 4 years of grief finally making room for something new. When they finally pulled apart, they found Siwoo standing in the doorway, having clearly been eavesdropping the entire time, grinning ear to ear. Finally, Siwoo announced dramatically, throwing his hands up. I thought I was gonna have to do everything myself. Watch it, Seok-hyun warned, though he was still smiling. Does this mean I can call you Mom now? Siwoo asked, suddenly quieter, more careful, all his usual bravado dropping away for the question that actually mattered to him. Josephine crouched down in front of him, pulling him into a hug, arm no longer aching, heart entirely full. Only if you're ready, she said softly. No pressure, whenever it feels right. It already feels right, Siwoo said into her shoulder, and Josephine had to blink back fresh tears as she held the boy who'd grabbed her hand in an alley 3 weeks ago and changed the whole direction of her life. Somewhere out there, Daesung was left to face a world without the protection of the family he'd tried to steal from. A fitting end for a man who mistook love for weakness right up until the moment it became the very thing that took him down. And in that cold marble house that didn't feel cold anymore, a family that never should have existed on paper sat together on a balcony overlooking Seoul, an African-American college girl from Brooklyn, a mafia boss who'd finally let his guard down, and a little boy who finally got to keep the people he loved. If this story had you holding your breath through that alley, that birthday party, and that sidewalk ambush, let me know your favorite moment down in the comments, because I read every single one of them. Hit that like button if Josephine and Seok-hyun earned it, and subscribe right now so you don't miss the next Afro-Korean love story dropping soon, because trust me, this world has a lot more stories left to tell.